Part 1, Chapters 6 and 7 of Bessie's Fortune by Mary Jane Holmes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 6. Miss Betsy MacPherson. The table was laid in the large dining-room which faced the south, and whose long French windows looked into the terraced flower-garden and upon the evergreens fashioned after those in the park at Versailles. When alone, Lucy took all her meals in the pleasant little breakfast-room, where only 2 pictures hung upon the wall, and both of Robin, one taken in all his infantile beauty when he was 2 years old, and the other at the age of 14, after the lovely blue eyes which smiled so brightly upon you from the first canvas were darkened for ever, and the eyelids were closed over them. This was Lucy's favourite room, for there Robin seemed nearer to her. But Geraldine did not like it. It was like attending a funeral all the time, she said. And so, though it was quite large enough to accommodate her Thanksgiving guests, Lucy had ordered the dinner to be served in the larger room, which looked very warm and cheerful with the crimson hangings at the windows and the bright fire on the hearth. After having regaled herself with a glass of sherry, a biscuit, a piece of sponge cake, and some fruit, Mrs. Geraldine had descended to the dining-room to see a new rug, of which Lucy had told her. Glancing at the table, which was glittering with china and glass and silver, she began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 places. You surely did not expect Burton's father? Lucy flushed a little as she replied. Oh, no, the 6th place is for Miss MacPherson. Miss MacPherson? What possessed you to invite her? I detest her, with her sharp tongue and prying ways. Why, she is positively rude at times and exasperates me so, Geraldine said angrily, and her sister rejoined. I know she is peculiar and outspoken, but at heart she is true as steel, and I thought she would be very lonely taking her Thanksgiving dinner alone. And then she will be glad to see you and inquire about her brother's family, whom she knows you met abroad. Yes, we spent a week with her brother, the Honourable John MacPherson, and his wife Lady Jane, at the house of Captain Smithers in Middlesex. Miss MacPherson is, at least, well connected, Geraldine said, mollified at once as she recalled her intimacy with Lady Jane MacPherson. To be acquainted with a titled lady was, in her opinion, something to be proud of, and since her return from Europe she had wearied and disgusted her friends with her frequent allusions to Lady Jane, and her visit to Penwyn Park where she had met her. And Miss MacPherson was her sister-in-law, and on that account she must be tolerated and treated at least with a show of friendship. So when she heard she had arrived, she went to meet her with a good deal of gush and demonstration, which, however, did not in the least mislead the lady with regard to her real sentiments, for she and Geraldine had always been at odds, and from the very nature of things there could be no real sympathy between the fashionable lady of society, whose life was all a deception, and the blunt outspoken woman who called a spade, and whose rule of action was, as she expressed it, the naked truth and nothing but the naked truth. Had she worn false teeth and supposed anyone thought them natural, she would at once have taken them out to show that they were not. And as to false hair, and frizzes, and powder, and all the many devices used, as she said, to build a woman, she abominated them, and preferred to be just what the Lord had made her, without any attempt to improve upon his work. Once Lucy Gray had asked her why she did not call herself Elizabeth or Lizzie instead of Betsy, which was so old-fashioned, and she had retorted sharply that though of all names upon earth she thought Betsy the worst, it was given to her by her sponsors in baptism, and Betsy she would remain to the day of her death. She was tall and angular, with large features, sharp nose, and little bright black bead-like eyes, which seemed to look you through and read your most secret thoughts. As her name indicated, she was of Scotch descent. Indeed, her grandfather was Scotch by birth, but he had moved into England, where her father and mother and herself were born, so that she called herself English, though she gloried in her Scotch blood and her Scotch face, which was unmistakable. After her birth, her father had bought a place in Bangor, Wales, which he called Stoneleigh, and there her 2 brothers, Hugh and John, were born, and her parents had died. She had come alone to Ellington when comparatively young, and, settling down quietly, had for a time watched closely the habits of the people around her, and posted herself thoroughly with regard to the workings and institutions of a republic, and then she adopted them heartily, and became an out-and-out American, and only lamented that she could not vote and take part in the politics of the country. Of her past life she never spoke, and of her family seldom. Her father and mother were dead. She had 2 brothers, both well enough in their way, but wholly unlike each other, she had once told Lucy Gray, whom she had always liked, and with whom she was more intimate than with anyone else in Allington, unless it were Hannah Jerrold. Although very proud of her family name and family blood, she was no boaster, and no one in Allington would ever have known that one of her brothers had been in Parliament, and that his wife was a Lady Jane Trevelyan, if chance had not thrown them in the way of Mrs. Geraldine. Once, and only once, had she returned to her native land, and that 2 or 3 years before our story opens. Then she had been absent 3 or 4 months, and when she returned to Allington she seemed grimmer and sterner than ever, and more intolerant of everything which did not savour of the naked truth. And yet, as Lucy Gray had said of her to her sister, she was true as steel to her friends, and at heart was one of the kindest and best of women, and with the exception of Miss Lucy Gray, no one in Allington was found so often in the houses of the poor as she, and though she rebuked sharply when it was necessary, and told them they were dirty and shiftless when they were, she made her kindness felt in so many ways that she was, if possible, more popular than Lucy herself. For while Lucy only gave them money and sympathy, she helped them with her hands, and if necessary swept their floors and washed their faces and made their beds, and sometimes took their children home and kept them with her for days. Such was Miss Betsy MacPherson, who, as she is to figure conspicuously in this story, merits this introduction to the reader, and who, in her black silk of a dozen years old, with a long heavy gold chain around her neck, and a cap fashioned after the English style upon her head, stood up very tall and stiff to receive Mrs. Geraldine, but did not bend her head when she saw it was that lady's intention to kiss her. "I know she would as soon kiss a piece of sole leather as me, and I would rather kiss a flour barrel than that powdered face," was her thought. And so she only gave her hand to Mrs. Jerrold, who told her how glad she was to see her, and how much she was pleased with her brother, the Honourable John MacPherson, and his charming wife, the Lady Jane. "Why have you never spoken of them to us? I should be proud of such relatives," she said. And Miss MacPherson replied, "Huh! What's the use? I'm no better, no worse for them." Just then the sound of bells was heard, and Hannah and Gray came in, and were received most cordially by Miss MacPherson, who unbent to them as she had not done to the Boston lady. Indeed, there was something even tender in her voice as she spoke to Hannah and inquired after her father. Then, turning to Gray, she laid one hand on his head, and taking his chin in the other, looked searchingly in his face as she said, "I wonder if you are the same boy I used to like so much, or has a trip to Europe spoiled you, as it does so many Americans?" "Not a bit of it," Gray answered merrily. "Europe is grand. Europe is beautiful. But she is very old, and I like young America better, with her freedom and her go-ahead, even if she is not as intensely respectable and dignified as her mother across the water." The dinner bell here put an end to the conversation, and Lucy preceded her guest to the dining room, followed by her brother, who had been more than usually affectionate in his greeting to his sister, whom he took in to dinner, while Gray escorted his mother and Miss MacPherson. 7. The dinner at which Bessie is introduced. The soup and fish had been served, and during the interval while Mr. Jerrold carved the big turkey which Hannah had contributed, and which she had fattened all the summer in anticipation of Gray's return and this very dinner, Mrs. Geraldine took occasion to introduce her favourite subject of conversation, Europe and its customs, which she thought so infinitely superior to those this side the water. "Humph!" ejaculated Miss MacPherson, with an upward toss of the chin. Then turning to Gray, she said, "And did you, too, like all the foreign habits?" "No, indeed," was Gray's reply. "Just thinking of having your coffee and roll brought to you in the morning while you are in bed, and eating it in the smelling room without washing your hands, and then going to sleep again. That is what I call very narsty, as the English say, though they do not use the word in that sense." "You forget that Miss MacPherson is English," Mrs. Jerrold said, and the lady in question at once rejoined, "Never mind. I do not believe in spoiling a story for relation's sake, or country's either, and I fully agree with Gray that the continental habit of breakfasting in bed, with unwashed face and hands, is a very nasty one, in the American sense of the word. I never did it, and never would." "You have been on the continent, then?" Mr. Jerrold asked, and instantly there came upon Miss MacPherson's face an expression of bitter pain, as if some sad memory had been stirred. Then, quickly recovering herself, she answered, "Yes, I was at school in Paris a year, and travelled another year all over Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. It may seem strange to Gray, who probably cannot realize that I was ever young, to know that I, too, have my alpenstock as a voucher for the mountains I have climbed and the chasms I have crossed. Did you go to Monte Carlo?" The question was addressed to Gray, who replied, "Yes, we were there 4 days." "Did you play?" "No, I did not even see them play. They would not let me in. I was too young, and I should not have played anyway, for I promised Aunt Lucy I would not," Gray said, and Miss MacPherson replied with startling vehemence, "That's right, my boy, that's right. Never, never play for money so long as you live. You have no idea what perils lurk around the gaming table, or what an accursed spot Monte Carlo is, beautiful as it is to look at. Those lovely grounds are haunted with the ghosts of the suicides who, ruined body and soul, have rushed unprepared into the presence of their Maker." None of the guests had ever seen Miss MacPherson so excited, and for a moment there was silence while they gazed at her wonderingly as she sat with lips compressed and nostrils dilated, looking intently over their heads at something they could not see, but which evidently was very vivid to her. Mrs. Geraldine was the first to speak, and she said, half laughingly, "You are quite as much prejudiced against rouge et noir as your brother, for when I told him I tried my luck at Monte Carlo and won $25, he seemed horrified, and I think it took him some hours to regard me with favor again." "Yes, and he had reason. The MacPhersons have all good cause to abhor the very name of gambling," Miss MacPherson replied, hitching her chair a little further away from Geraldine as from something poisonous. Then, in her characteristic way of suddenly changing the conversation, she said, "You saw my nephew, Neil MacPherson?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Jerrold replied. "We saw a good deal of him. He is very fine looking, with such gentlemanly manners for a boy. I should be glad if Gray would imitate him," and she glanced at her son, on whose face a cloud instantly fell. Miss MacPherson saw it, and turning to him she asked, "How did you like Neil? Boys are sometimes better judges of each other than older people. Did you think him very nice?" Remembering Miss MacPherson's love for the naked truth, Gray spoke out boldly. "No, madam. At first I did not like him at all. We had a fight." "A fight?" Miss MacPherson repeated in surprise, as did both Hannah and Lucy simultaneously, while Mrs. Jerrold interposed. "I think, Gray, I would not mention that, as it reflects no credit upon you." "But he insulted me first," Gray replied, and Miss MacPherson insisted. "Tell it, Gray, and do not omit anything, because I am his aunt. Tell it exactly as it was. I want the truth." Thus encouraged, Gray began. "I know I did not do right, but he made me so angry. It was the 4th of July, and we were at Melrose stopping at the George Inn, while Mr. MacPherson's family were at the Abbey Hotel close to the old ruin. There were several Americans at our house, and because of that the proprietor hung out our national flag. It was such a lovely morning, and when I went into the street and saw the stars and stripes waving in the English wind, I hurrahed with all my might and threw up my cap in the air. "May I ask why you are making so much noise?" somebody said close to me, and turning round I saw a lad about my own age, wearing a tall stovepipe hat, for he was an Eton boy. His manner provoked me quite as much as his words, it was so overbearing, and picking up my cap I said, "Why, it's the 4th of July, and that is the Star-Spangled Banner." "Star-Spangled fiddlestick!" he retorted, tapping the ground with the tip of his boot. "And so you are a Yankee? I heard there was a lot of them here." "Yes, I'm a Yankee," I replied, "a genuine down-easter, and proud of it, too. And who are you?" "I? Why, I am Neil MacPherson, an Eton boy, and my father is the Honorable John MacPherson, and my mother is Lady Jane MacPherson," he replied in a tone intended to annihilate me wholly. But I stood my ground, and said, "Oh, you are Neil MacPherson, are you? And your father is an honorable, and your mother a lady? Well, I am Gray Gerald of Boston, and my father is an honorable, and my mother is a lady too." "Now really you make me larf," he cried. "Your father may be an honorable, I believe you have such things, but your mother is not a lady. There are no ladies in America, born ladies such as we have in the United Kingdom. And pray, what have you Yankees done, except to make money, that you should all be so infernally proud of your country and that rag?" pointing to the flag. By this time my blood was up, and I squared up to him, saying, "What have we done? We have whipped Johnny Bull just as I am going to thrash you under that very flag which you were pleased to designate a rag." He saw I meant business and bucked off, saying, "Oh, but you can't. I'm the son of Lady Jane MacPherson, you know, and you can't touch me." "We'll see if I can't," I answered, and then I pitched in and thrashed him till he cried for quarter, and I let him go, threatening all sorts of vengeance upon me, the worst of which was that he would tell his mother and have me arrested for assault and battery. That was my introduction to Neil MacPherson, and I am ashamed of it now, for I came to like him very much. During the recital, Miss MacPherson had laughed until the tears ran down her cheeks, a thing very unusual to her, while neither Hannah nor Lucy could repress a smile at Gray's earnestness, but Mr. Gerald looked very grave and his wife annoyed and displeased. "I am glad to hear you acknowledge that you are ashamed," Mr. Gerald said, "for I was very much ashamed that a son of mine should so far forget himself as to fight a stranger whom he had never seen before. But in justice to you, I must add what you have omitted, which is that you went and apologized to the boy for the affront." "Did you?" Miss MacPherson said, turning to Gray, who replied, "Yes, and I must say that he received my rather bungling apology better than I supposed he would." "All right," he said, offering me his hand. "I dare say I was a cad to say what I did of your flag, but you needn't have hit me quite so hard. Where did you learn boxing?" "I never learned it," I told him. "It was natural to all the Yankees, who were born with clenched fists, ready to go at it." He believed me, and said, "Really, is that so?" and then he invited me to play billiards with him, and we got to be good friends, and he asked all sorts of questions about America, and said that our girls were the prettiest in the world when they were young. All the English say that, and Neil had heard it 40 times, so it was not original with him. He said, however, that pretty as they were, his cousin Bessie was far prettier, that she was a most beautiful little creature, and as sweet as she was beautiful. "Bessie!" Miss MacPherson exclaimed, with a peculiar ring in her voice, and a manner of greater interest than she had evinced in Gray's recital of his encounter with Neil. "Do you mean the daughter of Archibald MacPherson, my nephew? And did you see her? Did you see Archie?" Gray colored and replied, "No, I did not, for mother wished to punish me for fighting Neil, and so when a Mrs. Smithers asked us to spend a week with the MacPhersons at her home in Middlesex, I was left behind in London with some friends, but I had great fun. I went to the Tower and the Circus and the Abbey and the Museum and everywhere, though I was sorry not to see Bessie, who with her father and mother was also at Captain Smithers'." "You saw them, then?" Miss MacPherson continued, addressing herself to Mrs. Gerald. "You saw Archie and his wife and Bessie? What is Archie like?" "I never saw him, but I have his wife. She was the daughter of a milliner or dressmaker or ballet dancer from Wales, in the vicinity of Bangor or Carnarvon, I believe." "Carnarvon," Hannah repeated quickly, while a sudden pallor came to her lips and forehead, but no one noticed it, and Geraldine hesitated a little, uncertain as to how far she dared to tell the truth and not give offence. But she was soon relieved from all uneasiness on that score by Miss MacPherson, who, noticing her hesitancy, said, "Don't be afraid to tell me exactly as it is, for were Archie 10 times my nephew I would rather hear the whole truth, just as Gray told it of Neil." "So then, what did you think of Archie?" "I have an idea he is a good-natured, good-for-nothing, shiftless fellow, who never earned a penny in his life, and who gets his living from any one who will give it to him." She spoke with a great asperity of manner, and then waited for Geraldine, who replied, "You have stated the case in much stronger language than I should have done, but in the main I believe you are right. Mr. Archibald MacPherson is one whom you could not possibly mistake for other than a gentleman. He is courteous and kind, and agreeable, but very indolent, I should say, for he never stands when he can sit, and never sits when he can recline. Indeed, his position is always a lounging one, and he impressed me as if he were afraid of falling to pieces if he exerted himself." "Just so, that is what I thought," Miss Betsy said emphatically. "He takes it from his father rather than his mother. She, I believe, had some energy and snap. She was a chorus singer in some opera, and I did not like the match, though I now believe she was too good for Hugh. And now for Archie's wife, Daisy they call her. What of her?" Mrs. Gerald evidently had no scruples about freeing her mind with regard to Daisy MacPherson, and she answered promptly, "I did not like her at all. Neither did Lady Jane, and I tried my best to keep aloof from her, but could not. She is pushing and aggressive, and sweetly unconscious that she is not wanted. And yet she is exceedingly pretty, with that innocent kind of face and childish, appealing way which women detest but which takes with the men," and Mrs. Geraldine glanced sharply at her husband, who was just then very busy with his pudding, and pretended not to hear her while she went on. "She has some accomplishments, speaks French and German, I believe, perfectly, sings simple ballads tolerably well, but rolls her eyes frightfully, and is so conscious of herself that she disgusts you. I should call her a regular Becky Sharp, always managing to get the best of everything, and, as she told me herself, always having on her list 2 or 3 invitations for as many weeks, to as many different places." "But how does she do it?" Miss Betsy asked, and Mrs. Jerrold replied, "I hardly know, nor do the ladies themselves. Sometimes, as in the case of Mrs. Smithers, the invitation is genuine and sincere, but oftener it is a mere form at which Daisy jumps at once, thanking the lady sweetly, and either asking her to fix a time, or more frequently fixing it herself to suit her own convenience. She has a most wonderful talent, too, for getting presents of clothes and jewelry for herself and Bessie, and that is the way they live, for they have no means, or at least very little, except what she manages to get from the men by Filipinas, or bets, or games at cards and chess, where they allow her to win because she almost begs them to let her do so. She even got £5 from my husband on a wager, which he did not at first think in earnest." And again the black eyes flashed at Burton, who now looked up from the orange he was peeling, and said laughingly, "Yes, Daisy did me out of $25 in the neatest possible manner, and would have fleeced me out of 25 more, if I had not been on my guard against her. She got £25 out of Lord Hardy, who was a guest at the Smithers, but he acted as if it were a pleasure to be cheated by so pretty a woman, and she is the prettiest woman I ever saw." "Huh!" Miss Betsy said again, while Geraldine continued, "Yes, she is pretty, with a pink and white complexion, blue eyes and golden hair, which curls naturally, and which she still wears hanging down her back so as to show it to good advantage, and she is a woman of 30. "No, Geraldine, you are mistaken," Mr. Jerrold said quickly. "You forget that she was married at 17, and Bessie is only 8. So at the most Daisy cannot be more than 26. "I am glad you know her age so well," Mrs. Geraldine retorted. "I think 26 too old to wear one's hair streaming down the back." We were all disgusted, and especially Lady Jane, whose room was just across the hall, directly opposite hers. She told me herself that she would never have accepted Mrs. Smithers' invitation had she known that adventuress was to be there. And yet she was very kind to little Bessie. Indeed, no one could look at that child and not love her at once, and pity her, too, for the influence with which she was surrounded. "Yes, Bessie, tell me of her," and Miss MacPherson leaned forward eagerly. "They pretend she was named for me. Then why not call her Betsy, if that is her name?" "Would you call a child Betsy?" Hannah asked, joining for the first time in the conversation. "No, of course not. I think it horrid. But if I was christened Betsy, no power on earth could turn me into a Bessie. But go on and tell me about her." And she turned to Mrs. Geraldine, who continued, "She has her mother's wonderful beauty, with all its refinement of her father, and such a sweet expression that you feel like kissing her. Her eyes, like her mother's, are blue, but so clear and dark that at times they seemed almost black, especially when there came into them, as there often did, a troubled look, when Daisy was relating some of her adventures, which we knew could not be true. At such times it was curious to watch the child as she listened with her great wide open eyes and flushed cheeks, while her breath came in short gasps, as if she were longing to contradict her mother, and this she sometimes did. "Mamma, mamma, please," she would say, "haven't you forgotten? Wasn't it this way?" But a look would silence her, and there would settle upon her face and about her mouth that patient, sorrowful expression pitiful to see in one so young. "And her father, was he fond of her?" Miss MacPherson asked, and Mrs. Jerrold replied, "Yes, very, and she of him. She seemed to recognize the difference between him and her mother, and kept by him most of the time. It was a very pretty sight to see her with her arms around his neck, and her bright head leaning on his arm, while she looked up at him so lovingly and sympathizingly too, as they watched the manoeuvres of her mother. Once I heard her say to him, when Daisy was flirting more than usual and attracting all eyes to her, 'I shall never do like that. "But mamma is very pretty, isn't she?" "Yes, darling, very pretty," he answered, and then they kissed each other very quietly. I wish you could see Bessie. It was not often that Geraldine praised anything or anybody as she praised this little English girl who had made a strong impression upon her, and of whom she might have said more if Miss MacPherson had not rejoined. "I did see her once, and her mother too. I was home 3 years ago, you know, and I went to Aberystwyth in Wales, where I heard Archie was staying, but I did not make myself known to him, I was so disgusted with what I heard of his wife's conduct, which he allowed without a word of protest. But I was anxious to see the child, and one morning I sat on a bench on the marine terrace, watching a group of children playing near me. I was almost sure that the one with the blue eyes and bright hair was Archie's, and so I called out, 'Bessie MacPherson, are you there?' Instantly she came to me, and folding her hands in my lap, looked up at me with her wondering eyes, and said, 'I am Bessie MacPherson, not Betsy.' 'Weren't you christened Betsy?' I asked, and she replied, 'Yes, but they never call me that. It's a horrid name, mamma says.' 'Then why did she give it to you?' I said, and she answered with the utmost gravity, 'For some old auntie in America who has money, but she never sent me a thing, nor answered papa's letter. I think she is mean, don't you?' I did not tell her what I thought of the old auntie, though I could not repress a smile at her frankness, which pleased me more than prevarication would have done. 'Where is your papa?' I asked, and she replied, 'At the Queen's Hotel, but it is awful expensive there, and papa says we can't afford it much longer. But mamma says we must stay till she finds some place to visit. There she is now, and that is Lord Hardy with her. They are going over to the old ruins,' and she pointed to a young woman in the distance, bedizened out in white muslin and blue ribbons, with her yellow hair hanging down her back, and her big straw hat in her hand instead of on her head, and she was talking and laughing and coquetting with a short, spindle-legged chap, not much taller than herself, and looking with his light curly hair and moustache like a poodle dog. 'Who did you say he was?' I asked, and the child answered me, 'Lord Hardy, mamma's friend. He is very rich and very nice. He gives me lots of things, and sometimes buys us all first-class tickets, and then it is so grand. I don't like to go second class, but you see, papa is very poor.' 'How then can he afford to stop at expensive hotels?' I asked, and she said, while a shadow came over her face, 'We couldn't, if we didn't have one small room on the top floor where I sleep on the lounge. I never go to table d'hote, but stay in my room and eat whatever mamma can slip into her pocket without the waiter seeing her. Sometimes it is not much, and then I am so hungry. But mamma will get us an invitation to visit somebody soon, and then I can eat all I want.'" The guests had listened very attentively to this recital, and none more so than Gray, who leaned eagerly forward, with quivering lips and moistened eyes, as he exclaimed, "Poor little girl! How I wish she had some of my dinner! Why didn't you bring her home with you, away from her wicked mother?" Miss MacPherson did not reply, for there dawned upon her suddenly a fear lest she had talked too much, and her manner changed at once, while she sank into an abstracted mood, and her eyes had in them a far-off look, as if she were seeing the child who came to her upon the sands of Aberystwyth, and looked into her face with eyes she had never been able to forget, and which she could now see so plainly, though the little girl was thousands of miles away. Dinner being over, Hannah said it was time for her to go home, and Lucy accordingly ordered the sleigh to be brought to the door. "You will come to-morrow as early as possible?" Hannah said to her brother, who replied, "Yes, immediately after breakfast, for I must go back to Boston on the afternoon train. I have an engagement for Saturday." "So soon?" Hannah said, in a tone of disappointment. "I hoped you would stay longer. Father will be so sorry. He has anticipated your visit so much." "It is impossible. I have promised for Saturday, and must keep the appointment," and Burton Jerrold leisurely scraped and trimmed his thumbnail, but did not explain that the appointment he must keep was with the members of his club, who gave a dinner on Saturday. He knew very well that he could remain in Allington until Saturday afternoon, and then reach home in time for the dinner, but the place was almost as distasteful to him as to his wife, and he gladly seized upon any pretext to shorten his stay as much as possible. "Shall I tell father that you will come with Burton to-morrow?" Hannah asked her sister, who instantly assumed that air of invalidism which she found so convenient when anything disagreeable was suggested for her to do. Drawing her shawl more closely about her, and glancing with a little shiver at the window, she replied, "No, I hardly think I shall go out to morrow, it will be so cold, and probably stormy, but you may expect me for a little while on Saturday, if the day is fine." "But I shall come and stay till Monday, and I hope you have a lot of mince pies baked up. Last Thanksgiving we were in Paris, and had pea soup and brains and eels and stewed celery for dinner," Gray said, as he kissed his aunt and bade her good bye. End of Chapters 6 and 7